Some viewers may find the following video disturbing. Viewer discretion is advised.
The biggest shock of the Casey Anthony trial would actually happen on July of 2011, when the juror would return with a verdict. The reaction at first would be complete shock and would soon turn to pure outrage. And because it had gained so much media coverage, all the angry protesters would be standing around this courtroom protesting, and at that point in time were confident that Casey Anthony would go completely to Smith Row. Some of these protesters would even put duct tape over their mouths and would actually write over the mouths certain sayings. Some of them would include Baby Schmiller, and some of them would include Schmill Casey. But the juror would return and would say that they found Casey Anthony not guilty as lack of evidence to prove that she had unalived her daughter. One of the jurors, Jennifer Ford, would actually do a news interview and would tell this interviewer that there was not enough evidence to prove that she had unalived Kaylee. She would go on and say, "I'm not saying that Casey Anthony is innocent, but if you do not know exactly what crime the person committed, how can you determine the punishment for that crime?" Judge Belvin Perry, fearing that there could be a riot, would actually tell Cindy and George Anthony to actually leave the courtrooms before the verdict was read. He would also do the same thing for the juror members, and would actually refuse to have the information put out into the press until about a week later so people could actually cool down. But even though he would do this, juror members would still receive not only hateful messages, but even Smith threats. And Judge Belvin Perry would charge Casey Anthony and give her 1 year for each count of lying to the police, but would say during the entire time that she had been in prison, considering it time served. People would often refer to Casey Anthony's trial as OJ number 2. And many people to this day feel that the court system failed Kaylee Anthony. George would actually speak out after the trial and say that he had his own theory of what he thought happened. And it's a theory that he still believes to this day. George would say that Casey Anthony was a young teenager when she had Kaylee Anthony, and like most young adults, loved to go out and party. But he would say that Casey Anthony also was a mother, and so her responsibilities as a mother would always get in the way of her going out and partying. And he believes that Casey, like most bad mothers, would start giving her daughter Xanax to make her fall asleep, so she could go out and actually party. And anytime someone asked where her daughter was, she would just say Zanny the nanny has her, which is a code name or a street name for Xanax. But because she was giving her daughter Xanax every single day, Kaylee needed higher and higher dosages, and eventually accidentally overdosing her daughter. And for the most part, people believed either the prosecution's theory or George Anthony's theory. But this would not be the last we heard of Casey Anthony, and it would come out in 2016, where the private investigator Dominic Casey would actually release his affidavit during the Casey trial. Now, I'm going to start and say this. I'm by no means saying that people should take this affidavit as fact, but considering the other sources who were there at this time were Jose Baez and Casey Anthony being known as a pathological liar, and Jose Baez also having a reputation of not being very truthful, take it with a grain of salt. But I will say this: everything that Dominic Casey would write, he would sign under the perjury of law. And certain things that happened in this affidavit coincided with actually what happened in the courtroom. In the beginning of this affidavit, Dominic Casey would attest that he was contacted by Jose Baez's team, and they would inform him that they were trying to help Casey Anthony in her case, and would say that Casey Anthony had murdered her daughter and buried the body. and were trying to work towards trying to find someone to pin it on. Casey would also express how he believed that Miss Anthony had a lot of psychological issues. And during this time, she was constantly asking about the particular gate where Kaylee's body was. It would go even further and say that when Roy Kronk had actually identified the body, Casey would then contact Dominic Casey and suggest that they try to blame Roy Kronk for kidnapping Kaylee, trying to pin the crime on him. It would go much further where Casey would even try to blame Kaylee's unaliving not only on her brother, her father, and her mother. Inevitably, we know now that in the trial, Jose Baez would try to pin everything on George Anthony. There would be a couple things in this affidavit saying that Casey's relationship with Jose Baez was very inappropriate. There would be one time where Dominic Casey would recall where Casey Anthony had asked Jose to cancel a news interview. And he would do this and right afterwards would immediately tell Miss Anthony, "You now owe me 3 Haktuas." Dominic Casey would go even further and say that there was a time that he had went into Jose Baez's law firm and Casey Anthony would run out of his private quarters in a complete stage of undress, to where he would tell Miss Anthony, "You got to quit acting like this. This type of behavior cannot continue." Jose Baez would make a statement and would discredit these claims and would say that all of the claims were false. But considering how some of these things coincide with what happened in the trial, it's kind of hard not to see it as fact. Cindy would claim that up until 2021, her and Casey had a really good relationship. That is until they would have an altercation of an argument over Casey Anthony receiving Kaylee Anthony's ashes. This will turn into a verbal fight where Casey Anthony would gaslight her mother and would tell her that she lost her daughter based on the fact that she supported her husband, who was a SA person. To which Cindy would defend her husband and would remind Casey that everything that had happened, even to Kaylee's unaliving, was her fault. She would remind Casey that the only people that did anything for Kaylee was Cindy and George, because at the time she never worked or she had stole money from friends or family. And ironically enough, after this altercation, Casey Anthony would start filming a docuseries that would air on Peacock. In this docuseries, Casey Anthony would almost seem rehearsed in this docuseries and would not come off genuine or sincere. It was more than anything a 3-hour special of a smear campaign on her parents, where once again she was trying to put all of the blame on her father, and would even go over the fact that her father was a predator. George and Cindy Anthony would refuse to watch this docuseries as they had a feeling they knew what Casey was going to say, and would say that nothing Casey says can be believable. They would do a documentary themselves, and it would be called The Lie Detector Test. And in this docuseries, George and Cindy Anthony would agree to have a lie detector test over various questions. Some of George's would be, did you ever inappropriately touch your daughter? Did you ever inappropriately touch Kaylee? And did you ever help hide the body of Kaylee Anthony? During this docuseries, they would ask both George and Cindy if they had any issues, and Cindy would say the only issue they would have was the fact that George believed that Casey accidentally unalived Kaylee by using Xanax. And by the end of the docuseries, we would find out that everything that George and Cindy said were completely honest, and there was no detail of deception found in their statements. So I'll ask you, do you believe she was innocent? Do you believe it was an accidental overdose? Me personally, I kind of go with what the prosecution believes. Not only by the facts that they had laid in the courtroom, but from the release of Dominic Casey's affidavit confirms everything the prosecution was trying to lay out. May we never forget about Kaylee Anthony.